Welcome to the second session in our course on the writings of Cicero, and today I want to talk about the art and power of the spoken word. And the cover image is one of my artificial intelligence masterpieces. I wanted an image of somebody speaking in Rome in front of a great audience, and ChatGPT has done me proud, I think. There you have an entirely convincing image of such a scene, and it doubtless looked something like that. I suppose I could have used an actual painting of Mark Antony's address to the Roman people at the funeral of Julius Caesar, but this is good enough. So I want to talk about the nature of oratory. It's not just that Cicero was rather good with his words and he was able to stand up and persuade people. There is an enormous amount of artistry in the spoken word, and Cicero was a complete master of everything that the ancients knew about structuring words into a convincing argument. So let's begin with modern oratory, and it is an extraordinarily dispiriting subject. Modern oratory is not unknown. I have seen a number of speakers in Britain who probably classify as great. I used to know Tony Benn moderately well, and I attended a number of his speeches. He had a way with words. He could be very convincing. Michael Foote I saw speaking on a number of occasions, and I also saw Enoch Powell speak. And Enoch Powell is a very interesting example of a modern speaker because he was a great classical scholar, and every time he opened his mouth, he was thinking of Demosthenes and Cicero, and he could often turn out a very good speech that Demosthenes and Cicero would have admired in the technical sense. So modern oratory is not unknown, but it is a rarity. And the reason for that is that we don't live in a particularly democratic age. There is very little reason for the politicians to persuade us seriously. What they mostly do is they read speeches out written for them by other people. And I did used to write speeches for at least one member of Parliament, and that was a rather depressing experience. These speeches are written by other people, and they're read from a teleprompter. And here's a picture of a teleprompter. A great deal of effort has gone into deceiving the public. And so a politician will stand at this lectern. He or she will have the speech projected onto a glass screen, 2 glass screens positioned in front, so you can look up and you can look about as if looking at your audience, and you can make your eyes drip with emotion, but you're reading the words off the screen, and as often as you look down, there are the words scrolling up the main screen. That is how the majority of political speeches are given nowadays. Quite often at British party conferences, you'll see the party leader walking confidently about the stage, appearing to give a speech without a text, indeed without any notes. But what you will see is that right at the back of the hall is a very large screen with the speech projected onto it, and the speaker is reading the words off the screen. Modern politicians are performers, like actors in a stage play. You don't despise actors in a stage play because everybody knows that they are reciting words written by somebody else. But politicians are supposed to be giving you their own opinions in their own words. I've given a quote from Orwell's 1984. I don't want to read that because it will lower the tone of the entire session, but I'll look at bits of it. The use of newspeak encouraged a gabbling style of speech, at once staccato and monotonous, and this was exactly what was aimed at. The intention was to make speech, and especially speech on any subject not ideologically neutral, as nearly as possible independent of consciousness, For the purposes of everyday life, it was no doubt necessary, or sometimes necessary, to reflect before speaking, but a party member called upon to make a political or ethical judgment should be able to spray forth the correct opinions as automatically as a machine gun spraying forth bullets. His training fitted him to do this. The language gave him an almost foolproof instrument, and the texture of the words, with their harsh sound and a certain wilful ugliness which was in accord with the spirit of Ingsoc, assisted the process still further. I don't think we've quite reached that level, but if you look at the quality of many modern political speeches, we're not very far from that. There are 4 modern politicians. Can't blame Joe Biden for talking nonsense. He does have problems, shall we say. John Major, he was a particularly dreary public speaker, and I had to sit through a number of his speeches live when I was younger. They were about as dispiriting as sitting down to a dinner and finding that you had nothing to eat but cardboard. Then you have David Cameron, who was glib and never particularly truthful. Then you have Tony Blair, otherwise known as the Prince of Darkness. He did have a certain dark glamour about him, but if you read his speeches, he didn't write them, and they usually don't say anything at all. So that is the run of modern politicians. It hasn't always been like that, and it is not entirely like that. There are speakers of great ability in both Britain and America, but they're not the kind of people who tend to achieve high office. In the past, however, and I'm not looking at the English past, the great age of English oratory in the 18th and 19th centuries, if you go back a few thousand years into the ancient world, you will see that oratory as an art and as a skill is an entirely Greek development, and there is a little bit from a painting by Raphael, a very famous mural, showing the Greek philosophers. Words, endless words, often very beautiful words, but words and words and words. But the Greeks are the people who developed oratory as a technical skill and who turned it into one of the great human arts. And there were 3 reasons for the development of Greek oratory. The first is that the Greeks generally lived in systems where government was by persuasion. We need to qualify that, but I'll explain it as well. You have the beauty of the Greek language, which is something I will discuss, and also limitations of the written word. So let's begin with government by persuasion. There was a wide variety of forms of government throughout the Greek world. Sometimes you had absolute monarchies or tyrannies. Sometimes you had oligarchies where the rich, sometimes rich landowners, sometimes rich merchants, sometimes a combination of both, would dominate all decision-making. But the most famous of all the Greek states was Athens, and in Athens for about 300 years, government was entirely by persuasion. Athens was a democracy. It was not a democracy like ours, where you vote once every 4 or 5 years. The candidates, in order to become candidates with a chance of winning, need to be acceptable to the main parties and then acceptable to the media, which means acceptable to some very wealthy special interests. They solicit our votes with increasingly unlikely promises. Then, when they are elected, they go away and do as they are directed for the next 4 or 5 years, when the process repeats itself. The Greeks would not have regarded that as democracy of any kind. They would have regarded it as competitive oligarchy, where 2 different groups within the same ruling class compete for office. George Galloway, if you'll forgive a certain vulgarity, once described democracy as 2 cheeks of the same arse, which is not unreasonable. In Athens, however, there were very few elections for office. If you wanted somebody in Athens to look after the drains for the next 6 months, or to supervise the provision of sacrifices for the temples, or to look after the naval dockyard, or something like that, you would put all the names of the eligible citizens into a machine and pull names out automatically. So there would not be an election for these positions. Instead, somebody would pull out a name, hold it up, saying, Thrasybulus, son of Lyergetes, you are now in charge of the water supply for the next 6 months. Thrasybulus would be supervised. If he was obviously corrupt or incompetent, he'd be impeached before the courts. There would be a close examination of his financial affairs before entering into office and after leaving it to see if he'd been taking bribes. But most positions in the Athenian democracy were given by lot. It was a lottery. It was government by lottery. When it came to making laws, or declaring war, or making peace, or declaring any kind of policy, there would be a meeting several times a month in the marketplace where every Athenian citizen was able to go and, if he felt inclined, to speak and certainly to vote. So this was government by jury and by referendum, or government by lottery and by referendum. There was very little in the way of a permanent administration, and there was no elected government. This meant that it was a matter of critical importance, if you wanted a particular law to be made, to be able to persuade a majority of the meeting in the Athenian marketplace to support you. It was not a question of taking bribes or other inducements from a well-funded special interest and then using your friends in the press and your whipped members of parliament to fall into line behind you. It really was a matter of doing what is shown in this artificial intelligence generated image, of standing up and of speaking to the people. Now, these two parts of the Athenian system worked very well together. If we were to devolve most government to the parish level in England, it would be a disaster, because you'd have the meetings, but the meetings would be attended by various kinds of lunatic who would stand around speaking, deprioritizing motions, reprioritizing motions, raising irrelevant points of order. Most ordinary people would run away, and then the voting would start in earnest. When I was at university 40 years ago, that's what student union meetings were like, and I don't think that any kind of parish democracy would be substantially better. But the men to whom that man is speaking all have considerable administrative experience, because the process of government by lottery means that all of these men, or at least most of them, have held positions of some importance in the Athenian democracy. And because most officials served for 6 months, there was a pretty brisk turnaround, so probably all of those men had occupied positions of some importance in the city, and they had taken decisions of some importance, and so when they listened to this man speaking, they were able to judge the value of what he was saying. They would also know him quite well, so that if he was obviously corrupt or shifty in some other way, they would discount everything he was saying. So this was Athenian democracy, and this was democracy in a number of other cities in Greece. I can think particularly the city of Locris, which had a most interesting wrinkle in its constitution. If you wanted to propose a new law, you had to stand up in the assembly with a noose around your neck. If you persuaded a majority that the new law was good and useful, people would support it, and you'd go away loaded with praise. If, on the other hand, people thought the law was useless or dangerous, they would vote against it, whereupon the noose was grabbed and you were hanged immediately. What this meant was that in 200 years, Locris only had one new law made. So there are certain customary limitations on the ability of the people to choose exactly as they will. But that is the nature of Greek democracy, and it requires great skill in persuasive oratory, doesn't it? And let's have a look at these two quotations. What we're doing here is we're contrasting Oriental despotism with Greek freedom, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but let's go ahead. Herodotus, in his history of the war between the Greeks and the Persians, Artemisia was the queen of Halicarnassus, and she was a particular favourite of Xerxes, the great king of Persia, and she was quite willing to use that friendship to speak out freely. But Herodotus reports, Artemisia's friends were dismayed when they heard this speech, and thought that Xerxes would punish her for trying to dissuade him from battle. But those who were jealous of her standing amongst the most influential person in the forces were delighted at the prospect of her ruin. In fact, Xerxes let her off, but when you were speaking to an Oriental despot, you had to watch your words, because the wrong word could get you killed. And here is Pericles in his funeral oration in 429 BC. It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while there exists equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognised, and when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. So these political systems encourage and reward the ability to speak persuasively. And this was the case in most Greek states, even those which were not particularly democratic, and you'll find this in the Homeric poems, where quite often you have debates where people stand up and speak freely, and if they speak particularly well, what they say will become the policy. So that is one reason for the development of oratory in Greece. The other reason, and this is rather controversial, is the alleged beauty of the Greek language. Now, it doesn't matter what your language sounds like to outsiders. It can sound like dogs barking for all it matters. You will have a natural prejudice in favour of the beauty of your own language. However, it is possible to make a set of strong claims for Greek. It does have a certain structural harmony, those case endings, those verb conjugations, those participles, the very complex syntax. It's all very highly structured and all very logical. A piece of Greek prose does show a structural harmony which is often lacking in other languages. The language is also very expressive. It has an enormous vocabulary, not as large as the vocabulary of English, but much, much larger than the vocabulary of Latin and of most other modern European languages. It is possible to say things in Greek with a very high degree of precision. It is a subtle and a precise language. It also sounds good, or it sounded good. It has a phonetic richness about it. It has a distinction of long and short vowels and diphthongs. It also has a pitch accent, which makes spoken Greek sound naturally like song. There is a story about Philip of Macedon when the Athenians declared war on him. Philip read out the declaration of war sent by the Athenian assembly. He then threw it on the ground and began reciting it while dancing to its natural music. We don't know exactly how Greek sounded. We don't really understand the nature of this pitch accent, or if some people claim to understand the nature of the pitch accent, they are completely unable to reproduce it in their own speaking of Greek. But it made Greek a rather unusual language. And then you have a run of great writers in the language. I've given the names Homer, Sophocles, Plato, but I could expand that list and talk and talk and talk. But these are men who took a language that was already naturally beautiful when spoken or recited, and they raised it to very high levels. What I'm saying is that the Greeks liked the sounds of their own voices, and that tended to encourage a great deal of speaking. And the Greeks in all ages have been very fond of speaking. If you go to modern Greece, you'll hear it, though they are speaking a somewhat different language. And so this also tended to encourage the growth of oratory. Not only did you need to persuade people to follow your ideas, but if you set about persuading people in the right way, you would produce a speech of great artistic beauty, or you could produce a speech of great artistic beauty. You then have the scarcity of the written word. And if you go around an ancient city, if you go around the ruins of Ephesus, or if you look in Rome, or if you go to the Acropolis Museum in Athens, you'll see the written word everywhere, and that will give you the impression that the ancient Greeks, and by extension the Romans, were about as literate as the English were in, shall we say, the 17th or the 18th centuries. However, if you came away with that impression, you'd be entirely wrong. It does look as though in any generation in the ancient world, not more than about 5% of any population was literate. Because Greek, and by extension Latin, because those two languages have alphabets, where it is possible to represent any sound by combining 24 characters together, there was a great deal more literacy among the Greeks and the Romans than there was among the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Persians, where you had to learn thousands of characters before you could write a washing list. Even so, education was very expensive. It was also not as necessary among them as it is for us. We live in societies nowadays, and have done for about 300 years, where it is necessary for most people at least to be able to read and write. You need to be able to read and write, if only to read the timetable that your shift starts at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, or that you have a double shift, or that there's an order for an extra 5 tons of steel, and so you'd better get a move on with those machines. We live in societies which require literacy, whereas ancient societies didn't, on the whole, require literacy. A number of other reasons suggest that literacy was at a very low rate. The most obvious is the fact that we have glasses and they didn't. Effective glasses are an invention of the Chinese which came to Europe in about 1200, between 1200 and 1300. And there's a set of statistics on the top left of the slide which tells you the percentage of people in the United Kingdom who need corrective glasses for reading. A quarter of children, and once you get beyond 65, it rises to 90 to 95%. I don't entirely believe these statistics because I know that before I was pushed into an optician at the age of 7, I could read perfectly well. I also well remember that on the occasions in my teens when my glasses were broken for some reason, after a couple of days I could read perfectly well without them. And even nowadays with these varifocals, which are very corrupting to the eyes, if I were to take them off and leave them off for a few days, I could probably read rather small print. Nevertheless, many people would have trouble reading without glasses, and so far as there were no glasses in the ancient world, it made reading rather difficult. And there in the bottom left of the slide, I've given some modern estimates of the price of books. Books were tremendously expensive, and if we start in 1400, when the technology of reproducing books had not moved very far beyond what it was in the ancient world, the price of a Bible in 2020 terms was about £5,000. That does not encourage literacy. There's no point learning to read and write if you can't afford to buy anything to read. It's only in the past few centuries that improvements in printing technology have brought the price of books down to the point where everybody who wants one can have a book. The price of a Bible in 2023, apparently, if you looked around, was £4.75. Indeed, if you ask politely, doubtless somebody will give you a Bible for free. Somebody did that to me a few years ago. It just wasn't a very nicely printed one. So books were expensive. I've chosen the Bible because it is the only book which has been continuously published between 1400 and the present day. Also, it is the same book, so it's possible to compare meaningfully. You then have other difficulties in technology. Papyrus, a rather stiff, unyielding medium, very expensive. A single sheet of papyrus in today's terms would have been about £200, which means that most people, if they were able to write and if they were inclined to write, would not use papyrus as their first resort. They would use one of those waxed boards, and there's a picture from the British Museum I took a few months ago. This would once have been filled, that whole central part, with beeswax. You write on it with something that looks like a bronze nail, and when you've done with it, you copy it onto papyrus, or if you've done with it completely, you turn your stylus around, which has a large flat bit at the end like a chisel, and smooth the wax clean as if you're buttering bread, and start again. Or you can use pieces of broken pottery. So writing was expensive. Reading was expensive because books were so expensive. People didn't have glasses. The economic systems did not require literacy in the ways that our economic systems do. And for all of those reasons and for others, only about 5% at the most of any generation was literate. And so if you wanted to persuade people of your point of view, there was no point writing a pamphlet or a newspaper editorial, least of all a book. What you would do is you would stand up in public and you would speak your mind so that people could listen to you and make an immediate decision. So all of these reasons tended to encourage a growth of oratory among the Greeks and eventually among the Romans as a very important skill, not an adornment, rather in the same way as a Victorian lady would learn to play the piano. It was not something you did because it had a certain prestige attached to it. It was a matter of great practical importance to be able to speak coherently and persuasively and to sound good while you were about it. There are the names of three of the greatest of Greek orators. Lysias, one of the earliest. He was born in Syracuse. There's a bust of him on the top left. Born in Syracuse, settled in Athens, and he was known for a clear, plain, and effective style of oratory. And he made his living from writing forensic oratory. In Athens, if you had a dispute with another citizen and you wanted to go to court, you didn't employ a lawyer. You had to do all the work yourself. You would stand up in front of a jury of 399 people. So many because it was impossible to bribe all of them, and 399 so that there would always be a majority one way or the other. You would stand up in front of a jury of 399 of your fellow citizens, and you would have to argue your case. Obviously, not everybody was up to doing that. which is where someone like Lysias came in. You go to him, you explain your case, and he will sit down and he'll produce a speech for you. You're not allowed to stand up in front of the court and read the speech. You try to do that and they'll shout you down. They'll probably rule against you regardless of the merits of your case. No, you'd have to remember it and then give it. There is a story about Lysias. Somebody went to him for a speech. Lysias obliged, and the man came back to him a few days later saying, "You know, when I read this to myself the first time, I thought, wow, this is a speech of overwhelming power. If I give that in front of the jury, they'll surely find for me." And then as I set about learning it, I realised that there were certain holes in it. And the more I learned the speech, the closer I studied it, the more I realised that it doesn't represent my case very well. The speech is deficient in all sorts of respects. Could I ask you to have another go at the job? And Lysias waved his arm and said, "Oh, don't worry about that. The reason you find the speech deficient is because you've read it more than once, but the court will hear it once only, and that's all that matters." You then have Gorgias, another Sicilian, somebody else who settled in Athens. He's one of the men who treated oratory as a technical art. He specialised in taking speeches apart and analysing them, and in producing speeches which followed a particular pattern. He helped to turn oratory from something that you did of necessity to something you did as an art form, so that people would come along and listen to you, not because you had something important to say, but because you were able to say it particularly well. He has rather a bad reputation, and the examples we have of his speeches, I must say that I don't find them terribly interesting. It's wordplay, a lot of rhyme, a lot of assonance, a lot of alliteration, many technical tricks, which sound all right if you're 15, but once you get to my age, you look at this stuff and think, is that it? Have I got to read 50 pages of this stuff? No, life is too short. But then we come to the big one. We come to Demosthenes, the one who has a bigger bust than the others. He was Athenian, and he was one of the leaders of the Athenian assembly during the rise of Macedon as the great power in Greece. He tried to rally the Athenians and the other Greeks against Philip of Macedon. Eventually, he lost. After the death of Alexander the Great, Alexander's successor in Macedon decided that he didn't like Demosthenes. He decided Demosthenes had gone too far. So he sent envoys to Athens saying, "You may think that you're a free and independent city-state, but you're not. I control you. Will you arrest this man and send him off to me so I can have him tortured to death?" Demosthenes retired to a temple for sanctuary. The temple was closely surrounded, and he had no choice eventually but to take poison. A rather sad end to a most distinguished career. He was, in his lifetime, regarded as at least as great a power in Greece as Philip of Macedon at the head of his great army. When Demosthenes stood up in the assembly and opened his mouth, it is said that the whole of Greece shook from the echo of his words. I think it's Macaulay who said that it is impossible to change a single word in a Demosthenes speech without ruining the effect as a whole. Or perhaps Macaulay was quoting Cicero or Quintilian, I'm not sure, but I read it in Macaulay some years ago. Many of his speeches have survived, and they are still read with great appreciation. He was a master of persuasive oratory, and as I said, by the simple fact that he was so great a speaker, he was considered, and therefore he was, as great a power in Greece, one man alone with nothing but a brain and a voice box, as the great Philip of Macedon with his great and well-trained army. It's not simply a matter of being able to put together an effective sentence or a set of effective sentences as a speech that distinguished somebody as a great speaker among the ancients. There were many other things that it was necessary to do well. One of them was to have a good voice. It wasn't enough to be able to gabble through your speech so that people would say, that was well said. It had to be an entertainment from beginning to end. I mentioned Macaulay. He was a great speaker in Parliament, and his published speeches are among the great works of Victorian literature. They are well worth reading. But as a public speaker, Macaulay was deficient in ancient terms because he would stand up in the House of Commons and he would begin reciting his speech from memory in a rather dull monotone. People listened to it because the speeches were so good, but there were few graces about Macaulay's manner and voice, whereas an ancient orator was supposed to have a well-rounded, booming voice that could reach to the back of a marketplace. Very little artificial amplification in those days. He was also supposed to be able to reproduce any emotion at will. He also needed to have a pleasing appearance and to be able to use gestures and to walk here and to walk there as pointing to what he was saying. So it is a complete package. You need to have something to say. You need to have the literary ability to make your words memorable, and you need the voice and the general presence to make people willing to listen to what you had to say. As time went by, there were two contrasting styles of oratory, the Attic and the Asianic, and Cicero is a blend of both styles. The Attic style is named after the Athenians, and it is relatively plain language. It focuses on persuasion, simplicity and clarity, moderation and restraint, a close logical structure, an ethical appeal. The sort of speech that the Athenian assembly and the Athenian courts admired. It was an expression of their political culture. The Asianic style is something that developed on what is now the western coast of Turkey, in the Greek-speaking cities there, and later on in Syria and in Egypt, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, when the cities there became Greek. These were not democracies, and persuasion was not as necessary as in the ancient democracies. These were often the capitals of absolute monarchies. That doesn't mean that oratory fell silent. It became an entertainment. You had the development of a particular kind of oratory, rather florid, rather wordy, patterned, the kind of thing that would entertain people without persuading them anything, without telling them anything in particular. And you had the development of an entire literature of speeches which were, for most practical purposes, worthless. Imitations of characters in the past. A speech made by Helen to Menelaus when he finds her in Troy and she beseeches him not to kill her but to take her back as his wife, that sort of thing. No political danger in making this kind of speech, so somebody would make up a speech like that and he'd recite it at a dinner party hosted by the local king. So you have these two speaking styles, Attic and Asianic, and as I say, these tend to come together in Cicero's speeches. But let's have a look at oratory in Rome. And the relationship between the Greeks and Romans was a little unusual. The Greeks were the special people of the ancient world. Most people accepted that. The Persians, for example, conquered the Eastern Greeks and ruled them, but they never insisted that the Greeks should learn Persian. Indeed, the Persian rulers appear to have learned Greek, which is a little unusual. You do not learn the language of one of your subject people for speaking to them. If you're ruling them as a governor, you may learn the local language to help you get your point across, but generally speaking, you expect them to understand you, whereas the Persians underwent a cultural capture by the Greeks, a slow and partial capture. For the Romans, it was more extreme. The Romans took their encounter with Greece in about 250 BC as something like a bolt of lightning. It transformed them. They were smitten with love for the sound of Greek. They fell in love with Greek civilization, and they wanted this for themselves. For a while, it looked as if the Roman upper classes would give up on Latin, and they would write in Greek, and they would become Greeks, in the same way as the Macedonian aristocracy had given up on the Macedonian language, and they had turned themselves into Greeks, or as millions of Egyptians, Syrians, Persians, and barbarians after the reign of Alexander turned themselves into Greeks. The Romans didn't do that. What the Romans decided eventually was that they would adopt all the standards of Greek civilization, but they would adapt Greek literary conventions to Latin. They would have their speeches, they would have their histories, they would have their philosophies and their letters in Latin, but as imitations of the Greek. So the Romans gave themselves a vernacular literature copied from Greece, and this is something unprecedented. It's something that we take for granted. You will see people in Africa writing English, books in English, newspapers in English, writing plays in English, using English as their first language sometimes, equally in India and large parts of the Far East. They have turned themselves into native English speakers, or they have translated virtually the whole of English literature into their own languages. This was unusual in the ancient world, but the Romans set about it. They translated the Greek classics into Latin, and they set about producing imitations of those classics, which eventually became classics in their own right. And the Romans adopted the whole of Greek education, and naturally enough, they adopted all the conventions of Greek oratory. Rome was not a democracy in the way that Athens was. I explained last week that Rome had a rather oligarchic constitution. Even so, it was necessary for a well-born young man to be able to make a good, persuasive speech. You need to make a speech to the Senate, if you're a rather senior Roman, or if you're standing for election, or you're proposing a course of action in one of the popular assemblies, you need to be able to stand up and speak to people and to get results. All of the conventions of Greek oratory found their way into Rome and were adapted to Latin, and very soon you had a whole native school of Roman orators speaking Latin, but using the conventions, using the techniques of Greek oratory to their benefit. And this is where Cicero comes into the picture. So let's move to Cicero. There's a nice picture of Cicero. It's a fresco from 1464. He's a studious boy reading a book. It's all rather anachronistic, but it's a pretty picture. Cicero was born in 106 BC in Arpinum, a town in central Italy. He was born into the upper middle class in today's terms. He was not born into the top drawer aristocracy, but he was born into a wealthy family. From an early age, he showed a keen intellect and a passion for learning. His father had the wealth and the inclination to encourage his son, and so Cicero received the best education as a boy that a young Roman could, and his education would begin at about the age of 7, not by learning Latin, but by learning Greek. Until he was about 13, everything Cicero read was in Greek, and he would be taught by Greek-speaking tutors. It's only once he got to about 13 that the curriculum switched to such Latin classics as existed in his own day. It's then that Cicero would have begun the study of Roman law and history. Cicero studied under tutors in Arpinum before his family moved to Rome, and there he received much more advanced instruction from a Greek poet called Gorgias, and he's the man who introduced Cicero properly to Greek literature and culture. So a standard upper-class Roman education began with the Greek classics. They began with an immersion into Greek culture and the Greek language, and only later switched into Latin. And that is why when Cicero reached his late teens in 79 BC, or actually his early 20s, he was packed off on a tour of Greece and Asia Minor. He was sent on, I suppose, the equivalent in English terms of a grand tour. He was sent off to Athens, where he studied philosophy at the Platonic Academy. There is a mosaic from Pompeii representing the Academy in Athens, and since the Academy existed in 79 AD, I suppose this is a fair representation of how it looked. You see people sitting or standing around, reading and arguing, talking and talking and talking. And that's the kind of education that Cicero received in Athens. He also went to Antioch and to Rhodes, where he studied under a number of very famous and influential Greek educators at the time. One of his most influential teachers was Macaulay in Rhodes, a very famous speaker. He is the person who persuaded Cicero that there was no real distinction between the Attic and the Asianic style of speaking. They were both equally suitable to their purposes, and a skilled speaker would use either or would blend them together exactly as required by the circumstances of the case. So Cicero came back to Rome in his early or middle 20s with an excellent education in both Greek and Roman civilization, though perhaps it's difficult to distinguish between the two in what is called Greco-Roman civilization, as fluent in Greek as in Latin. And what was he to do? And the answer is that the road to preferment in Rome led through the law courts. Nowadays, if you study law, well, actually, let me rephrase that. If you study law in England, it is possible that you will specialise in law and you'll become a conveyancing solicitor or a criminal barrister, and you'll spend your life doing that. However, it is possible that you regard a legal education as a stepping stone to a political education, and although it's no longer as common as it was in the middle 20th century, very often British politicians have a background in law. Certainly in Rome in the 1st century BC, the stepping stone from private life into politics was through the law courts. So Cicero became a lawyer, he became an advocate. And the hope was that he would become a speaker of note in the courts, and he'd become very well known to the Roman people. He would thereby be able to get himself taken up by some powerful man or group of powerful men, and he would be able to put himself forward as a candidate for office. His first significant case, his first significant public case, was in 81 BC, a defence of Sextus Roscius, who was accused of murdering his father. At first it looked like a pretty certain case against him, but Cicero was able to raise doubt after doubt after doubt about the evidence against Sextus Roscius. But what is most notable about the speech is that Cicero spoke very boldly, very freely, against a freedman and a favourite of the dictator of the day, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He spoke against Lucius Cornelius Chrysogenus. He accused Chrysogenus of having corruptly procured this prosecution and of having produced a great deal of faked evidence against Roscius. The circumstances of the case are not enormously important. What is important is that this was in the aftermath of the First Civil War, one of the three big civil wars that tore the Republic to pieces. This was at the end of the First Civil War. The man who'd come out on top was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who'd turned up in Rome and promptly murdered 9,000 people and confiscated their estates. Everyone was scared of him, and yet in this case, Cicero was bold enough to stand up and mount a direct challenge against the dictator, or a direct challenge against one of the dictator's favourites, which boils down to an indirect challenge against the dictator. Cicero got away with that, but he won the case, and this was a notable victory. It was a notable victory for a number of reasons. It showed Cicero's ability as a public speaker. He was not able simply to produce a mass of pretty words that diverted and entertained his audience. He was able to turn what looked like a dead certain prosecution into an acquittal by raising doubt after doubt. A good, logical presentation of his case. He also showed his complete lack of fear of consequences. Now, I say a complete lack of fear. You'll see next week that Cicero was not a very brave man. He was rather timid on the whole, but he was prepared on occasion to take risks, and on this occasion he did take a big risk. The risk paid off, and after this, Cicero was one of the most famous lawyers in Rome. For the next few years, he specialised in defending individuals against powerful interests. He earned a reputation as a defender of the downtrodden and a champion of justice. I'm going ahead slightly now. In 75 BC, he was elected quaestor. That's the first step on the cursus honorum, the course of honour. Remember I said last week that before you could stand for one senior office in the Republic, you needed to have served in a number of other offices, and there were age limits, there were minimum age limits for each office. In 75 BC, at the lowest age when he was eligible, he was elected to a rather low-ranking magistracy as a quaestor, a financial officer who served under the governor of a province. But because he served as quaestor, when his year of office was up, he was eligible to be elected as another more senior officer, and so the idea was that he would proceed through those offices, successfully completing his term of office, and each would qualify him to become a candidate in a more senior office, and he would eventually make his way up to the top of the political tree in Rome, getting himself elected consul. But in 75 BC, he was elected quaestor, and he was sent off to help oversee the financial administration of this province. And this was an election that transformed his life. Before we move on to the case, let's see what Cicero himself had to say about the nature of public speaking. And this is something I've said already, but we might as well see it in Cicero's own words. A successful speaker will avoid extravagant gestures and stand impressively erect. He will not pace about, and when he does so, not for any distance. He should not dart forward, except in moderation with strict control. There should be no effeminate bending of the neck, or twiddling of his fingers, or beating out the rhythm of his cadences on his knuckles. He should control himself by the way he holds and moves his entire body. He should extend his arm at moments of high dispute and lower it during calmer passages. Once he's made sure he does not have a stupid expression on his face and or a grimace, he should control his eyes with great care, for as the face is the image of the soul, the eyes are its translators. Depending on the subject at hand, they can express grief or hilarity. So, public speaking is not simply a matter of standing up and saying your piece. There is an entire art of body language that goes with it, and Cicero wrote at some length about how this should be managed. And then Cicero says about himself, "Personally, I'm always very nervous when I begin to speak. Every time I make a speech, I feel I am submitting to judgment, not only about my ability, but my character and honour. I am afraid of seeming either to promise more than I can perform, which suggests complete irresponsibility, or to perform less than I can, which suggests bad faith and indifference." There is a passage that many politicians nowadays might read with profit, shall we say. He was a completely successful orator, and here are some comments on Cicero by his contemporaries, or somewhat after then. Plutarch, who wrote in the 120s AD, that is 150 years after the death of Cicero, but he had good sources. Cicero's eloquence was held in such great admiration by his contemporaries that they regarded it as an almost superhuman achievement. Or Plutarch quotes Julius Caesar, and Caesar and Cicero were political enemies. Caesar said to him, "It is more important to have greatly extended the frontiers of the Roman spirit than the frontiers of the Roman Empire." Or, for the general effect of Cicero's speaking on Julius Caesar, again Plutarch, this is when Caesar was the dictator. He had defeated all of his opponents in the Mediterranean world, and he was now the supreme power in Rome and the Mediterranean, and Cicero was in semi-retirement and out of fashion. But it is said also that when Quintus Ligarius was under prosecution because he had been one of the enemies of Caesar, and Cicero was his advocate, Caesar said to his friends, "What is to prevent our hearing a speech from Cicero after all this while, since Ligarius has long been adjudged a villain and an enemy?" But when Cicero had begun to speak, and was moving his hearers beyond measure, and his speech as it proceeded showed varying pathos and amazing grace, Caesar's face often changed colour, and it was manifest that all the emotions of his soul were stirred, and at last, when the orator touched upon the struggles at Pharsalus, he was so greatly affected that his body shook, and he dropped from his hand some of his documents. At any rate, he acquitted Ligarius under compulsion. Julius Caesar was no fool, not a man given to transports of emotion. He is the supreme master of the Roman world. Cicero is a defeated enemy. Cicero had been on the other side, and he has been spared by Caesar in the general amnesty. He's out of fashion, he's in semi-retirement, he's brought out of retirement to defend one of Caesar's enemies, whose acts were apparently so gross that Caesar exempted him from the general amnesty, and yet, even rather late in life, and in most unfavourable circumstances, Cicero was able to produce an effect on Caesar, who was sitting as one of the judges in the case, that Caesar had to acquit the man. In the next lecture in this course, I was asked if I would give a spoken example of Cicero's Latin. I gave the first two sentences of his first Catiline oration. My ability to read Latin as dramatically as Cicero could speak it is, shall we say, limited. But here we go. Here are the first two sentences. Quousque tandem abutere Catilina patientia nostra, quam diu etiam furoris te tuus nos eludit, quem ad finem sese effrenata iactabit audacia, nihil ne te nocturnum praesidium palati, nihil urbis vigiliae, nihil timor populi, nihil concursus bonorum omnium, nihil hic munitissimus habendi senatus locus, nihil horum ora voltusque moverunt. It may have sounded something like that, but I don't make any warranties for it. All of that practicing, all of that careful drafting of speeches had its effect. This is the Roman Empire in Cicero's day. It was a work in progress, and throughout his life it continued to expand, but this is the empire in about 60 BC. You'll see it's not as big as it later became, but it is the great power of the Mediterranean world. How do you integrate a foreign empire with a republic at home? The Roman answer was that you integrate it into this cursus honorum, this round of elections. You get yourself elected as a praetor or a consul or something, and at the end of your term in office you are assigned a province to go off and govern. It had, I won't repeat myself, but I'll simply remind you that this had a very corrupting effect on Roman politics, because it meant that getting yourself elected to some rather dull administrative job in Rome was the prelude to several years of vast enrichment in the provinces, and that tended to make elections rather riotous things. The payoff for being a praetor or a consul, the payoff for occupying one of those senior positions in the Roman Republic, was that at the end of your term of office you were assigned a province to rule, a province to govern with autocratic authority. While you were the governor of a province, no one could interfere with what you were doing there. You could do pretty well whatever you wanted. In extremes, it was possible for the Senate to impeach you in absentia and to dismiss you from your office, but that is not something that happened with any kind of frequency. For the most part, a governor went to his province and ruled it with absolute and unaccountable power. It meant that if you were a rather bad person, you could behave very badly and you could come back monstrously rich. If you were quite a good person, you could still come back very rich with golden opinions. There are very few governors who came back from their tour of service poorer than when they started. That was not the purpose of being a provincial governor. Now, the first province was Sicily. When the Romans conquered Italy, they did so by a patchwork of treaties and capitulations and other agreements, in which for the most part the cities conquered or incorporated into the Roman dominion were allowed to rule themselves. They were given internal home rule. At the end of the First Punic War, at the end of the first of the great wars with Carthage in 241 BC, the Romans found themselves in possession of Sicily, which was their first conquest outside of Italy. Because Sicily was a rather complex mix of ethnicities, Greeks, native Sicilians, whoever they were, Carthaginians, Latin speakers and what have you. Because Sicily was a rather complex mix of ethnicities, it was not terribly convenient to give it any kind of home rule, and also the Roman state had built up a vast mass of debt during the Punic War, and Sicily was rich, and so Sicily was made into a cash cow for the Roman state, and for that purpose it was given a governor who ruled as an absolute despot during his time in office. And this was the model for Roman provincial government as the empire expanded. Because Sicily was so rich, and because Sicily provided Rome and Italy in general with a great flood of corn, it had to be very carefully managed, and the government of Sicily was controlled by a praetor, that is, a junior governor. He was assisted by 2 quaestores, and Cicero's first public office was as a quaestor, a financial officer attached to the governor of Sicily. Some of the cities in Sicily were allowed to keep their ancient constitutions, and they had at least the semblance of local autonomy, but the Romans were never terribly friendly to the idea of democracy. In these cities, power tended to be concentrated in the hands of the wealthy elites. So Sicily is a wealthy province. It is a wealthy possession of the Roman state. It is a very important province, not just for the money and the corn, but also for its position in the centre of the Mediterranean. It's necessary to govern Sicily with a certain sensitivity, but in 74 BC, a completely worthless man, Gaius Verres, secured the praetorship by bribing the electors. He then abused his authority in Rome as praetor to further the political ends of his party. As a reward for a rather scandalous term of office in Rome, the Senate sent him out as governor or propraetor of Sicily. One might expect that in Sicily, Verres would be quietly corrupt, quietly rather wicked, and he would come back very rich. But it seems that when he turned up in Sicily, Verres thought, the gates of heaven have opened, I can do whatever I like, and I'm going to do everything that I want, and I don't care what anyone thinks of me. He became the most extravagantly corrupt and oppressive governor in Roman history. He ruined the wheat growers of Sicily, the people on whom Rome depended for its food, by raising taxes and by the arbitrary cancelling of contracts. He also robbed temples, which is an obvious no-no. Imagine that you're sent off, you're sent off to govern one of the remaining British colonies, and your first act is to break into the Methodist hall and take out all the pews, to take all the Bibles and sell them on eBay or something. It's the sort of thing that you don't do, but Verres did it. He stripped the temples of their ancient treasures. He also ignored the rights of Roman citizens settled in Italy. On one particularly notorious occasion, he got into an argument with a Roman citizen and had him flogged in the marketplace of Messina. It was a very serious offence to flog a Roman citizen. Being a Roman citizen was a most valuable status, and it enjoyed all manner of protections. But Verres had the man stripped and flogged in the marketplace, and as every blow fell on his body, the man cried out, "I am a Roman citizen." Verres' answer to that was to have the man taken up onto one of the hills above Messina and to have him crucified so he could look across the water to Italy. There's no reasonable doubt that Verres did that. Everything we know about Verres is from Cicero's prosecution speeches, but nobody in antiquity thought it worth trying to compose a defence for Verres, so we can take the charges largely as true. Then, during Verres' time in office, you have what's called the Third Servile War, or the Spartacus Revolt in Italy. I won't go into the details of that because we've all seen the film, which is not perhaps the best account of the Third Servile War, but we know who Spartacus was. In Sicily, Verres turned the Spartacus Revolt to a money-making enterprise. He would approach wealthy men and say, "One of your slaves is plotting to raise a rebellion in Sicily. He's working with Spartacus. I'm going to have your slave crucified or tortured to death in some unpleasant way." Many of the owners would then say, "Oh, no, don't do it to him. He's one of my favourite slaves. No, please." And then Verres would demand a large bribe to drop the matter. Or sometimes he would accuse a slave owner of having an entirely fictitious slave and accusing the slave of plotting with Spartacus. When the owner was unable to produce this slave to argue against the charges, Verres would regard the matter as having been proved, and again he would collect a large bribe to drop the matter. Verres served out his term as governor of Sicily, behaving badly, but behaving badly without any precedent. Roman governors were not always completely honest. They were not always very nice men. But Verres outdid every bad governor in his corruption and his oppression and the general chaos that he left behind him. He couldn't even keep the coasts of Sicily free from raids by pirates. On one occasion, he sent one of his favourites, a rather worthless young Greek called Cleomenes, at the head of a fleet to chase off some pirates. The sailors began to starve because Cleomenes had stolen all the money that was supposed to be used for feeding the sailors, and when they did come across a pirate fleet, they turned about and sailed off in terror. Verres disgraced himself. He disgraced himself and he disgraced the Roman name in Sicily during his time in office. When Verres got back to Rome in 70 BC, after 4 years of beastly behaviour in Sicily, he was followed by representatives from some of the Sicilian cities. They wanted a prosecution of Verres for corruption and misgovernment. And there was a court in Rome which had been set up to deal with such things, but the court was generally toothless, and when it wasn't toothless, it was corrupt. Verres knew most of the judges in this court, and, well, birds of a feather flock together. He expected that he would be acquitted as a formality. But these Sicilians, they remembered Cicero for when he had served as a quaestor in Sicily, so they approached him and they told him the story of what Verres had got up to in Sicily. At first Cicero didn't believe them. It was so outrageous, it was so unlikely that this could have happened in Sicily. So he went to Sicily and he began to investigate, and he discovered that the complaints of the Sicilians in Rome were, as one might say, the tip of the iceberg, that something utterly gross had taken place in this Roman province during the time of office by Verres. So he hurried back to Rome and began the prosecution. As I said, Verres was not terribly worried about this because the court was composed exclusively of senators, and some of these were the friends of Verres, and he thought that it would be a formality. but he employed the most eminent of Roman lawyers, a man even more eminent at this time than Cicero, a man called Quintus Hortensius, and Verres made sure to have the sympathy and support of some of the most powerful men in Rome. At first, his defence lawyer Hortensius tried to have the case delayed. He tried to have it put off until the following year, because the president of the court, as chance would have it, was Manius Acilius Glabrio, a rather unusual figure in Roman political life at this time, so far as he was completely honest. He was simply not susceptible to any kind of bribery or political pressure. At first, Hortensius tried to have the case delayed, and he tried increasingly inventive legal devices to try to have adjournment after adjournment or simple postponements of the case. But eventually Cicero defeated him, and he got the case into court, and in August 70 BC, Cicero stood up to begin his prosecution. Now, a prosecution in this court followed a particular order. You have a short opening speech from the prosecutor in which he explains the nature of the charges, and he also gives notice of the kind of evidence that he'll be producing. The next day, the prosecutor will make a much longer speech in which he gives the details. He produces documents, and at the end of his speech, he'll produce witnesses to prove the charges. On the third day, the defence will begin, and so the prosecution will continue to the end when the judges or the assessors will reach their decision. In August 70 BC, Cicero got up in court. Verres felt very confident about the whole matter, and Cicero gave his short opening speech. The effect of the speech was so overpowering that at the end of the day, when the court had adjourned, Hortensius, Verres' lawyer, went to his client and said, "Bearing in mind what's come out on the first day of the proceedings, and bearing in mind what I know Cicero is up to producing tomorrow, I don't think you have any chance of an acquittal." Verres was surprised, but Hortensius insisted, and then he said, "I also do say that if you persist in a defence, you'll have to do so with another lawyer. I don't want to continue as your lawyer in this case." Verres threw all of his movable wealth into some wagons and trundled out of Rome and continued trundling further and further west until he reached Marseille in France, or Massilia, which was an independent Greek city-state in the western Mediterranean. It was a satellite of Rome, but it was formally independent. It was outside Roman territory, and there was no extradition agreement, and so Verres took himself out of Rome to avoid being found guilty. The next day, Cicero didn't need to deliver the great speech that he had drafted. Verres was found guilty by default, and that was the end of Verres. I'll say more about him in a moment, but because Cicero was not able to deliver the great speech he had composed, he published it. He published it as a pamphlet, and it is the second oration against Gaius Verres. In my edition upstairs, it fills about 150 pages. It is one of the most damning attacks on misconduct in public office that has ever been produced. There are some extracts from the English translation. "Will you not, Verres, deny that you sold judicial decisions for money, that you spared no one, however innocent, if he could pay nothing, and that you condemned no one, however guilty, if he could pay you, will you not deny that you kept in your house all the marks not only of your own profligacy and cruelty, but also of the sufferings and calamities of others, that you delivered up Roman citizens to be tortured, and that you flogged them with rods in your own house? These things, monstrous and incredible as they are now so notorious that they cannot be denied. And so the flood of denunciation continues chapter after chapter, or in a modern edition, page after page. Some of the charges against Verres almost defy belief, but as I said, nobody in antiquity thought to compose a reply to Cicero. Cicero had his enemies, and if there had been reason to believe that he was over-egging his prosecution, that he was bringing in weak charges or charges without evidence, then somebody would have said, look, I agree that Verres was a pig, but Cicero has plainly lost all touch with reality here. None of this can be true, and I can prove it. But nobody did that. Which doesn't mean that Verres was guilty as charged, but it's very good reason to believe that he was. This is one of the greatest prosecution speeches that Cicero ever delivered. It is the greatest prosecution speech that he ever delivered. And as I said last week, it is a prosecution speech which has had a continuing effect down the ages. Cicero had revealed a weakness in the system of Roman imperial government, and the weakness was that if somebody like Verres were to be given a province to manage, he could do anything he wanted, and it would then be very difficult to bring him to any kind of justice. This would bring scandal on the whole structure of Roman government throughout the Mediterranean. Although nothing much was done during Cicero's own lifetime, when the empire was established, when Augustus became the first emperor, you have a series of enactments so that governors were placed under the close supervision of the central government, and it was possible for the people of a province to send a petition to the emperor asking for a governor to be recalled and put on trial for misgovernment. This is what happened eventually to Pontius Pilate. He gets rather gentle handling in the Gospels, but it seems that Pilate was corrupt and oppressive, a rather junior kind of Gaius Verres. Eventually the senior Jews wrote off to Tiberius, saying, will you do something about this man? Tiberius recalled Pontius Pilate to Rome, along with the Jewish high priest Caiaphas, for trial. What happened to them after that, we don't know, but undoubtedly during the imperial period, governors of provinces were under close supervision, and charges of misgovernment would be taken seriously by the imperial government. In the 18th century, the speeches of Verres were closely studied, and they helped to inspire the prosecution of Warren Hastings, and so it continues. Every empire that has been other than a looting enterprise, shall we say, has had time to sit down and read Cicero's prosecution speeches against Gaius Verres, and to try to avoid this kind of scandal. So it is a prosecution of continuing significance. The effect of Cicero's prosecution of Verres was to make him the most famous and the most sought-after advocate in Rome. There is an inscription put up by the city council of Enna in Sicily in 1960. It is an inscription praising Cicero, who was the defender of Enna and of Sicily against the robber of temples, Gaius Licinius Verres, who was a Roman governor of the island. And this was put up by the city council of Enna as an eternal memory of Cicero's actions on behalf of the Sicilian people. So that's not all I could say about the Prosecution of Verres, but that says pretty much everything that you need to know at the beginning. And here is a reading list. Here is a bibliography which incorporates some of the stuff I sent you last week that didn't arrive. It's all here now. There are some general histories of Greek and Roman oratory, which are worth looking at. Donald Russell's Greek Declamation is a particularly good source. For the early life of Cicero, or for general biographies of Cicero, there are some works. And then you have more detailed works on the prosecution of Gaius Verres. So there is a semi-complete reading list, and I'll give another reading list next week. That's not everything I could say about these matters, but that's everything I have time to say. Does anybody have any questions to ask? Any questions or any comments of any kind?